Hello and welcome to The Download from Wise Woman and Wordsmith, where insight meets inspiration. A space for creatives, dreamers and visionaries ready to spark new ideas, ignite purpose and reimagine possibilities. Here we share downloads of wisdom, stories and strategies to help you thrive in your creative journey. I'm your host, Jill Marshall. Tune in, connect and let the magic unfold.
Show you tomorrow.
Here's something you may not have realised. Archetypes don't wait until you're ready to receive them. They arrive fully formed, sometimes barging into your life before you've even realised you're carrying them. For me, the teacher arrived one afternoon disguised as a bluff. Now, I've never wanted to be a school teacher, so it might actually be better to call this archetype a trainer, or even, dare I say it, a motivational speaker stroke leader. But for now, because that's really what I became over time, let's stick with teacher. So this was back in the day. I was a few years out of university, still in that liminal space of being technically an adult, but really not having the faintest idea what that meant. I'd entered a career in human resources and thought I'd find training as part of that interesting, doable. I hadn't actually done any, but I had briefly left HR to follow a mentor in management development and had sat in on a number of courses on a smattering of topics. Along with the vast amounts of books that I've absorbed, I still credit this period with my ability to speed read, which has proven to be a very useful skill over my lifetime. But despite all of that, I had never actually run a training course. In truth, I'm not sure I'd even stood in front of a professional workplace audience with a PowerPoint clicker in my hand. Then, in a short period of unemployment and indecisiveness, a job came up, a proper training job. And the interview wasn't just a cosy panel with tea and a few competency questions. It was a whole morning. Design a training session, present it, stand up there as if you've been doing this your whole life. And something in me said yes, without hesitation, without a second thought about whether I had the right experience or whether this was actually madness. I said yes because somehow I already knew that I could do it and it would come naturally. I knew in some strange deep down way that this was mine. And somehow I got the gig. Well, more correctly, I got a contract. The permanent job went to someone else, but the company, and it was a very, very big organisation, had liked my delivery so much that they created a second opportunity. And that opportunity was mine. A few weeks later, I jumped right in, and some critical dates were penciled up on the schedule of courses in this very large training centre. And the irony? Well, my very first assignment as a so-called professional trainer was a 2-day course on, of all things, presentation skills. I can still laugh about it now. Me, hardly out of cap and gown, standing in front of a group of professionals twice my age, teaching them how to be confident and charismatic in front of an audience. Teaching them how to command a room when I had never, not once apart from in my interview, delivered a training session in my life. The audacity, the nerve, the absolute bluff. But here's the thing. Not only did I really enjoy doing it, but I absolutely nailed it. The surveys at the end came back with 10 out of 10 across the board. People wrote comments about how insightful, how engaging, how useful it was. They assumed I was an old hand at this. And, let's be honest, I never corrected them. Now, I hadn't really lied, and I had gone through the whole assessment process, but I guess I had obscured the truth. And what truth is that? Well, the only explanation I can find, even now, is that something else stepped in that day. The archetype of the teacher took the wheel. It knew what I didn't. It poured itself through me as if I'd been doing this forever. I now call it the intuitive bluff. We all know the phrase, bake it till you make it, pretend long enough and maybe you'll convince yourself as much as everyone else. But that's not what this was. It didn't feel like faking. It felt like recognition, like stepping into a role that was already written into me. There was no bravado, no puffed-up swagger, no crushing nerves either. Just this calm, almost eerie certainty, I can do this. So that's what I mean by the intuitive bluff. It's not deception, it's not smoke and mirrors. It's intuition taking the shape of confidence, effectively pulling something through you before you've technically earned it or even learned it. When I look back, the best way I can describe it is this. That day, I borrowed from my future self. I borrowed her composure, her ease with audiences. I borrowed her ability to think on her feet, to adjust when the energy in the room dipped, to let humour in when it was needed, to pull the whole group forward together. And it's still something I enjoy to this day. I love nothing better than to be on my feet in front of an audience, large or small. I had help, of course, with some pre-organised training notes and a couple of viewings of similar courses. But really, the rest of it was me. I borrowed the self who already existed in potential. The self who would then go on to become a director of training and development divisions in even bigger organisations, who would set up her own training organisation and teach thousands of aspiring writers how to craft novels, picture books, children's books. The self who would later stand in halls and stadiums full of children on school visits, who would teach courses online long before Zoom made that fashionable, who would develop mentoring programs like the fiction editor scheme I run today, and now the Hero's Journey training I'm about to launch. That first bluff wasn't a con, it was a foreshadowing, a glimpse, if you like, of the person I was becoming. And somehow, my future self lent me her confidence in advance. Now, I do have to point out that performance has probably always been part of me. I've been on stages all through school, making up dances in infant school and coercing my friends into dressing like a crocus and doing that dance with me, writing and performing skits in junior school, acting in plays, slipping into characters, speaking lines as if they were my own. I'd learned timing, pacing, how to hold silence, and how to let words land. But then I'd arrived at Cambridge University, and everything shifted. Cambridge, with its grand halls and cobbled courtyards, its aura of brilliance and opportunity. The place where the Footlights comedy troupe launched, and still launches, careers. A breeding ground for sharp wit, fast minds, shining stars. I honestly thought, and said so to a newspaper journalist, that was why I was going there. To join, to shine, to prove myself. And yet, I froze. I never even auditioned for the Footlights. Not once. The confidence that had carried me through performance after performance seemed to evaporate. At the time, I thought I'd failed, that I wasn't good enough, that the voice I thought I had wasn't strong enough for that particular stage. And I still look back at that time with regret that I didn't just force myself to go for it. But now I can also see it differently. It wasn't that the performer archetype left me. It was that it was waiting for a different doorway, waiting for a flip chart, which I still love to have in my room, and a training room instead of a comedy sketch stage. Because sometimes the stage we imagine is not the stage where our archetype is meant to show up. And for me, that doorway was training, or learning and development, or even group coaching, as it's become over recent years. Which, if you think about it, is funny in its own way. I went to Cambridge dreaming of comedy stages, and instead my first true stage was a training room with a squeaky marker pen. But here's the thing. Archetypes don't just arrive and then stay neatly put. They also crumble. They get challenged, they fracture, and then they reform. So for years, I did public speaking of various types with absolute ease. As an author, I've stood in front of dozens, sometimes hundreds, and occasionally thousands of children, doing book talks, school parades, library events. I strode out onto those stages with joy. I never really doubted my ability to hold an audience. And then slowly, something changed. I've spoken before in another episode about the silencing of women, the cultural, personal, systemic ways women's voices can be pushed down, dismissed, undermined. And somewhere in that time, my own confidence cracked. I started to stumble over words. I lost my fluency. I've mentioned this before, but I remember vividly once holding my own face still with my hand because it was trembling with fear while I spoke. I was suddenly reduced to physically steadying myself so my voice wouldn't betray me. For years, people around me had said, "You should do a TED Talk. You're made for that platform." And yet, right then, I couldn't have even done a talk to teddy bears. Archetype of the teacher, the speaker and the performer, it had cracked. My inner knowing was fractured. My voice felt like it was slipping away. Carl Jung would have recognized this moment. He wrote about how archetypes don't only empower us, they also break us down. When the old form of an archetype has outlived its expression, it collapses, sometimes violently, imploding like a star, so that it can re-emerge in a deeper, more authentic way. Jung himself went through a terrifying period after his split with Freud. Dreams, visions, even breakdown-like symptoms. He thought he might be going mad, and yet it was out of that crumbling that his greatest work was born. The Red Book, the foundation of so much of his later psychology. I think of that when I remember those shaky years. My teacher archetype didn't disappear. It broke apart so it could reform. It forced me to find a different relationship with it. Not as a smooth stage presence, but as a guide who knew what stumbling felt like. And Jung wasn't the only one. Think of Maya Angelou, who as a child stopped speaking for nearly 5 years after trauma. Her voice was silenced completely. And yet out of that silence emerged one of the greatest voices of the 20th century, a poet, a speaker, a truth-teller, whose words moved nations. So, although my teacher archetype crumbled, I don't mean it ended. It went underground, like someone in exile, waiting for the right conditions to return, waiting for a new form. For me, the teacher eventually returned, not as the booming voice to children in a stadium, encouraging them to beat out a G-Mama rap with their feet and hands or create a dance to Matilda Peppercorn's anthem, but as the gentler, steadier guide, mentoring editors, as the explorer of archetypes, launching the Hero's Journey training, as the voice in your ear right now, speaking into this podcast microphone. The archetype didn't disappear, it reconfigured. It came back deeper, more compassionate, more aware of fragility. And maybe that's what made it real. And this is why I believe archetypes are bigger than skills. That first day of training, the teacher archetype swept in before I'd even recognized it. Later, after silencing and stumbles, it crumbled. And then it returned, reshaped, carrying both the triumph and the tenderness of what it means to lose your voice and find it again. Archetypes are forces of expression. They don't care whether you've clocked enough hours. They don't care whether you feel ready. They care that you say yes. And all the while, another thread was running beneath the surface, what I call the invisible curriculum. We think learning only happens in classrooms and workshops or through official qualifications. But in truth, most of our real curriculum is invisible. For me, the HR work, the shadowing of a management mentor, the years of acting on stage, the author visits to children, even the trembling, the silences, the near collapse, all of it was part of the training. When I stood up in that first course, it wasn't conjured from nothing. It was drawn from a well that I hadn't known was full. And that's why the Intuitive Bluff worked. It wasn't blind faith. It was a recognition of something already seeded. And quite often, when we encounter something like this, it's not that we're finding a new archetype. It's that we're waking one up again. We're remembering who we are. And look at the ripples it causes. That one bluff turned into a career of training divisions, running programs, teaching thousands of people to follow their passions and dreams. It turned into online courses before online teaching was mainstream. It turned into this current season of my life, mentoring editors, training guides, developing the Hero's Journey. Every ripple traces back to that first yes, that first moment of borrowing from my future self. So what if this is what intuition really is? Not just a hunch about the present, but a temporal bridge, a way of reaching into the future and pulling back a thread of what's waiting. That day, I wasn't faking it. I was inhabiting the person I was already becoming. Jung and Philip Pullman might have called it the demon. D-A-I-M-O-N, the guiding spirit who pulls us forward. I call it a download, a piece of the future self landing in the now. The archetype of the teacher had already chosen me. My job was simply to stop resisting. So let me ask you this. Where in your life are you bluffing a little right now? Not deceiving, not lying, bluffing in the sense of trusting. Where are you stepping into something unproven but already embedded? Where are you borrowing confidence from the person you're becoming? And where might you need to forgive yourself or somebody else for the crumble, the silence, the trembling face, the lost words, knowing that the archetype never really leaves you? Because sometimes the leap doesn't follow transformation. Sometimes the leap is the transformation. So in closing, the download has always been about invisible threads, archetypes, synchronicity, ancestral echoes, hidden patterns of who we are. And sometimes those threads don't move neatly from past to present. Sometimes they leap from the future into the now. And sometimes they break apart and reform. But always, always, they are weaving you into the person you already are. So if the calling is there, the capacity is already seeded, even if it trembles and falters and disappears for a while and then returns in a different form. When this type of archetype arrives, what Robert Ohotto would call an archetype of destiny or soul, rather than a survival archetype of adaptation or of fate, whether bold or broken, trust it. Step in. That isn't a bluff. That's intuition. That's your future self, lending you the courage to begin and the compassion to carry on. Thanks for tuning in to the Download podcast. Feel free to like, comment and share and all of that good stuff. Also, I'd love to hear more about your own intuitive hits and downloads. So do find us on Facebook, YouTube and more.